Something unusual happened in a conversation you were never supposed to hear. Your soulmate was speaking to a complete stranger, and somehow, without planning to, they began talking about you. Not casually. Not as though you were simply another person from their past. Their voice changed the moment you entered the story, becoming quieter, more thoughtful, as if describing you required them to reach for words they normally kept hidden. And the stranger noticed. That is where this story truly begins, because your soulmate did not give this person everything. They shared only fragments, a memory, something distinctive about your nature, the way you make people feel understood without demanding attention, perhaps one small detail that would mean nothing to most people. Yet somehow, those fragments were enough to make this stranger stop and ask, "Who is this person?" Your soulmate hesitated. Maybe even smiled. Because how do you explain someone who has occupied a place in your thoughts that ordinary language cannot quite describe? And what they said next created a question this stranger has not been able to forget. Here is the part you may not expect. The stranger was not fascinated because your soulmate described you as perfect. It was almost the opposite. They heard something deeply human in the way you were described. Someone who has learned to carry disappointment without becoming cold. Someone who may disappear into silence when life becomes overwhelming, yet still finds a way to show kindness when nobody is watching. Someone whose presence can feel stronger after they leave a room than while they are standing inside it. The stranger listened carefully, and eventually they asked something your soulmate had been avoiding even asking themselves: if this person matters that much, why aren't they here? For a moment, there was no easy answer. Just silence. And sometimes silence reveals more than a perfectly rehearsed explanation ever could. Don't skip what comes next, because this is where curiosity quietly changed direction. The stranger stopped asking about the relationship and started asking about you. What are you like when you're comfortable? What makes you laugh unexpectedly? What do you care about when nobody is trying to impress you? What kind of dreams do you keep private? Your soulmate answered some questions and avoided others, but with every answer, the stranger began forming a picture, not of your appearance, not of some fantasy, but of your character. And something about that picture stayed with them long after the conversation ended. Maybe you know this feeling yourself. Someone mentions a person you have never met, but the way they speak about them makes you wonder what kind of human being could leave such a recognizable imprint. That was what happened here. Except the stranger's curiosity did not disappear the following morning. Then came the detail that changed everything. Your soulmate had mentioned something small about you, something so ordinary they probably forgot saying it. A place you enjoy. A creative interest. A phrase you often use. A dream you once shared. Perhaps simply the way you approach life when everything around you becomes noisy. It was not enough information to magically identify you, and this is not some impossible coincidence. But it was enough to make the stranger wonder whether your paths had already crossed without either of you realizing it. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer just a story about somebody somewhere. You had become real to them. And the stranger began paying attention. Stay till the end, because there is a reason your soulmate's description affected this person so deeply. It was not romance. It was recognition. Something your soulmate said about you reminded this stranger of an unfinished chapter in their own life, a question they had been carrying, a decision they had delayed, perhaps even a person they once wished they had understood better. Without knowing you, your story held up a mirror. And now they want to find you, not because destiny guarantees some dramatic outcome, but because they believe meeting you could answer something that conversation unexpectedly awakened inside them. Your soulmate never intended for that to happen. They were simply speaking honestly for once. But there is another layer. Because later, when your soulmate realized how seriously the stranger had taken everything, their reaction was not what anyone expected. They became careful. Almost protective. Suddenly they wanted to know why this person was so interested in finding you. The stranger gave an answer that sounded simple at first, until your soulmate understood what was actually being said. Something important is waiting for you in that answer, because it reveals why your name, or perhaps only the idea of you, has remained in a stranger's mind after one conversation should have ended. And the strangest part? Your soulmate left out one detail about you. One detail they deliberately chose not to reveal. The stranger sensed it immediately. And when they finally asked, "What aren't you telling me about this person?" your soulmate went completely quiet, because that missing piece is the reason this story is only beginning. The silence lasted just a little too long. Not enough to make the moment uncomfortable, but enough for the stranger to understand that they had touched something your soulmate had been carefully protecting. Your soulmate looked away, searching for a safer answer, because the missing detail was not a secret in the dramatic sense. It was something far more personal, the way they still reacted when someone mentioned a person who reminded them of you. The tiny pause before answering. The softness that entered their voice. The memories that appeared without invitation. Until that moment, the stranger had assumed they were hearing a fascinating story about someone meaningful. Now they realized they were sitting beside a person who had not completely understood the depth of their own feelings. And that changed the entire conversation. Because the stranger was no longer wondering only, "Who are you?" They were wondering, what happened between these two people that still carries this much meaning? Your soulmate could have ended the conversation there. Instead, after another quiet pause, they revealed something they had not planned to say at all. They explained that what made you difficult to forget was never one extraordinary event. It was the accumulation of small things. The way you noticed changes in someone's mood before they explained themselves. The way you could make an ordinary conversation feel strangely memorable. The way you sometimes protected your deepest feelings behind humor, distance, or calmness. And perhaps most importantly, the way you never seemed to realize how much of an impression you were leaving while simply being yourself. The stranger listened differently after hearing that. Something about those words felt familiar. Not because they suddenly knew you, but because they understood what your soulmate had been trying, and failing, to describe. Some people impress you immediately. Others become important slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you notice they have become connected to memories you never expected to keep. Your soulmate was describing the second kind. And apparently, you were that person for them. Then the stranger asked a question that completely shifted the atmosphere. Do they know you speak about them like this? Your soulmate did not answer immediately. And somehow, that hesitation was the answer. Maybe you never knew. Maybe conversations ended before everything could be expressed properly. Maybe timing created distance where honesty could have created understanding. Or maybe both of you assumed there would always be another opportunity to say what mattered. Whatever the reason, the stranger suddenly understood that they were hearing words that perhaps should have reached you first. Don't skip this next part, because this was the moment their curiosity became something more purposeful. They did not want to find you merely because you sounded interesting. They wanted to understand whether the person they had just heard about was aware of the impact they had made. There was something almost unfinished about the story, like walking away from a book with one page missing. Yet your soulmate became cautious again. "You're taking this too seriously," they said, perhaps with a small laugh intended to lighten the moment. But the stranger noticed something beneath that response. Your soulmate had spent the entire conversation describing you with extraordinary detail while simultaneously pretending the story did not matter quite so much. That contradiction was impossible to ignore. And sometimes an outsider notices what the people inside a story cannot see clearly. The stranger leaned back and said something unexpectedly simple. "I don't think you're trying to tell me about them. I think you're finally admitting something to yourself." Those words landed differently. Your soulmate became still. Because there are moments when another person gives language to something we have been carefully avoiding, and suddenly the room feels quieter than it did seconds earlier. No dramatic revelation followed. No impossible promise. Just recognition. Your soulmate began replaying the memories they had already shared, almost as though hearing their own story from outside themselves for the first time. And the stranger saw the shift happen. The conversation that began with you had somehow led your soulmate back toward a truth about themselves. But then something even more unexpected occurred. The stranger remembered a detail from earlier in the conversation. A tiny detail your soulmate probably believed had gone unnoticed. Something connected to where your paths might naturally cross. Not an address, not anything intrusive, simply a shared interest, a familiar environment, or a community where people with similar passions occasionally appear. And the stranger asked one careful question about it. Your soulmate immediately understood what they were thinking. "You're not actually going to look for them, are you?" The stranger smiled, but their answer was more thoughtful than playful. They were not interested in chasing someone who wanted privacy. They were not trying to force an encounter. They simply said that if life ever placed you naturally in the same room, they would recognize the story before they recognized your face. Think about that for a moment. Someone who has never met you now carries an impression of you built entirely from the way another person spoke about you. Not an image. Not a perfect version. An emotional outline. And perhaps that is what made everything feel so unusual. The stranger had heard about your quiet strengths, your contradictions, the things you may underestimate about yourself, and the strange ability you apparently have to remain present in someone's thoughts even after circumstances change. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate then asked the stranger a question of their own. If you ever did meet them, what would you say? The stranger thought carefully. Their first answer disappeared before reaching their lips. Then they said something so unexpected that your soulmate actually laughed, but not because it was funny. It was the kind of laugh people make when a sentence reaches somewhere deeper than expected. "I wouldn't tell them anything about you," the stranger said. "I'd ask them one question." Your soulmate wanted to know which question. The stranger hesitated, almost enjoying the mystery now. Then they finally revealed it. I'd ask whether they have any idea how differently someone speaks when their name enters the conversation. Your soulmate had no response. And perhaps neither would you. Because sometimes we move through another person's life without ever witnessing the version of them that exists when we are absent. We never hear the stories. We never see their expression change. We never know which tiny memory survived. Stay with this, because the conversation should have ended there. In fact, it almost did. The stranger stood to leave, your soulmate believed the subject was finished, and ordinary life began moving again. But just before they separated, the stranger turned back with one final question, a question your soulmate had absolutely no preparation for. "There's still something you haven't told me," they said. Your soulmate frowned. "What?" And the stranger answered quietly, "You told me how they changed you. You never told me why you let them go." This time, the silence was different. Because there was an answer. Your soulmate had carried it for longer than anyone realized. And when they finally began explaining what truly created the distance between you, the stranger discovered that the story they had been hearing was not the story they thought it was at all. What came next was not an excuse. Your soulmate did not blame timing, distance, circumstances, or some dramatic misunderstanding. Instead, they admitted something far more human. When your connection began to matter more than expected, they became uncertain about what to do with it. There had been a point when speaking to you felt effortless, when neither of you needed to define every silence or measure every word. Then something shifted. The connection started carrying weight. Small moments began meaning more. Your absence became noticeable. Your attention mattered differently. And rather than risk saying too much before they understood their own feelings, your soulmate began saying less. The stranger listened without interrupting, because suddenly many pieces of the story were fitting together. What looked like distance had not necessarily begun with indifference. It may have begun with hesitation. And hesitation, when allowed to grow quietly, can create miles between two people who were once only one honest conversation apart. Your soulmate remembered moments when they almost reached out. Messages written and reconsidered. Ordinary reasons invented to start a conversation. Questions they wanted to ask but decided could wait. Nothing cinematic happened in those moments. That was precisely why they mattered. Life rarely announces the exact second when a connection begins changing direction. Sometimes the important moment looks completely ordinary until months later, when you realize how much depended on what neither person said. And the stranger noticed something your soulmate had apparently overlooked. Throughout the entire explanation, they remembered astonishingly specific details about you. Not grand events. Tiny ones. A sentence you once said without realizing it would be remembered. The way you reacted when something genuinely surprised you. A particular idea you became animated while discussing. Even the kind of silence you carried when something was clearly on your mind. "You remember all of that?" the stranger asked. Your soulmate looked almost surprised by the question. Apparently, they had never stopped to consider how much had remained. And then came a realization neither of them expected. Perhaps forgetting you had never really been the goal. Perhaps your soulmate had simply been trying to place the memory somewhere manageable, somewhere it could exist without demanding an answer. But memories do not always cooperate with the places we assign them. Sometimes they return when a song sounds familiar, when someone asks the right question, when a stranger unexpectedly creates enough safety for the truth to surface. Don't skip what happened here, because the stranger suddenly understood why they had become so curious about finding you. It was not because your soulmate had given them a mysterious description. It was because every detail carried the same invisible pattern. You had apparently affected someone without trying to control the outcome. There was no performance in the story. No claim that you were flawless. Your soulmate even mentioned your stubborn moments, your tendency to retreat when you needed space, perhaps the way you sometimes overthought things instead of saying what you truly wanted. Yet even those imperfections were described with warmth. That made the stranger trust the story more, not less. They were hearing about a real person. Someone complicated enough to be believable and meaningful enough to remain memorable. Then, almost without warning, the stranger asked, "What do you think they believe happened?" Your soulmate froze. Until then, the entire conversation had been told from one side. Their memories. Their hesitation. Their interpretation. Nobody had asked what the experience might have looked like from where you were standing. Maybe you believed they simply stopped caring. Maybe you interpreted their silence as certainty. Maybe you eventually stopped looking for meaning because protecting your peace mattered more than solving an unanswered question. The possibility visibly affected your soulmate. Because suddenly they were imagining something they had avoided, that while they had been privately carrying all these complicated feelings, you might have received nothing but distance. And distance, without explanation, can tell a completely different story. Something important is waiting for you in what happened next. Your soulmate did not immediately decide to contact you. They did something quieter. They began correcting the story inside themselves. Instead of asking, "Why did this person disappear from my life?" they started asking, "What did I leave unsaid?" That single change transformed the conversation. The stranger could see it happening. Your soulmate was no longer describing you as someone belonging to a closed chapter. They were wondering whether the chapter had ever actually been given a proper ending. And that is when the stranger said something almost uncomfortable in its simplicity, "Maybe finding them isn't the first thing that needs to happen." Your soulmate looked confused. Had this not been the same stranger who had spent half the conversation fascinated by the possibility of meeting you? But their curiosity had evolved. They understood now that finding a person physically means very little if nobody is prepared to meet them honestly. Before anyone finds them, the stranger continued, "You need to know what you would say if they suddenly walked through that door." For the first time that evening, your soulmate had absolutely no answer. Imagine that. They had spent so long remembering you, describing you, explaining the distance, defending the silence. And yet they had never seriously imagined the simplest possibility, you standing in front of them again. What would happen after the first hello? Would they pretend nothing had changed? Would they hide behind humor? Would they finally acknowledge the conversation that never happened? Your soulmate lowered their eyes and admitted, almost reluctantly, "I don't know." The stranger smiled softly. "Then maybe that's what you need to figure out." And for several moments, nobody spoke. The urgency disappeared. The mystery softened. Something more meaningful replaced it, clarity beginning to form where confusion had lived for too long. But the story was not finished. Because as they were preparing to leave, your soulmate suddenly remembered something, an almost forgotten detail connected to the last meaningful conversation the two of you shared. A sentence you had said near the end. At the time, they had interpreted it one way. Now, after everything the stranger had asked, those same words sounded completely different. Your soulmate repeated the sentence quietly. The stranger stopped walking. "Wait," they said. "Say that again." Your soulmate did. And this time the stranger's expression changed, because hidden inside that ordinary sentence was something neither of them had noticed before. Not a secret code. Not some impossible prediction. Something much more believable, and perhaps much more important. You may have been trying to leave the door open all along. And your soulmate had mistaken it for goodbye. The sentence had sounded ordinary when you first said it, almost too simple to deserve a second thought. Yet now your soulmate could hear the difference between what they assumed you meant and what you may actually have been trying to communicate. You had not demanded an answer. You had not asked them to make a promise. You had simply left enough warmth in your final words for another conversation to remain possible. At the time, your soulmate had interpreted your calmness as closure. Now the stranger offered another possibility. Perhaps you were not closing the door at all. Perhaps you were respecting their space while quietly allowing them to choose whether they would ever walk through it again. That realization changed the atmosphere completely. Your soulmate repeated your words once more, slower this time, as though listening to them from your side of the story. And suddenly they remembered your expression, the pause before you spoke, the way you seemed to wait for half a second longer than necessary. None of those details proved anything extraordinary, and the stranger was careful not to pretend they did. But together they raised a question your soulmate could no longer dismiss so easily. What if both of you had mistaken uncertainty for an ending? What if neither person had truly chosen distance, yet both eventually accepted it because the other seemed to? There was something painfully human about that possibility. Two people can care deeply and still misunderstand each other. Two people can protect themselves so carefully that they accidentally hide the very truth the other person needed to see. And sometimes the distance between, they don't care, and they don't know what to say, is invisible from the outside. The stranger could see your soulmate mentally returning to moments they had considered settled. A conversation that ended sooner than expected. A message answered too carefully. A time when you seemed to want to say more but changed the subject. Even an ordinary goodbye that now felt less final than memory had made it. Stay till the end, because this is where the stranger stopped being fascinated by the story and became surprisingly protective of you. They told your soulmate something they were not expecting to hear. Don't turn this realization into a reason to rush into their life. Your soulmate looked up immediately. Until then, it had seemed as though the stranger wanted nothing more than for your paths to reconnect. But now they explained the difference between curiosity and respect. If you had spent time rebuilding your peace, learning yourself, moving forward, then whatever happened next had to honor the person you had become, not merely the version your soulmate remembered. Those words landed heavily, but gently. Because your soulmate had been talking about memories while somewhere beyond that conversation, you had continued living. You had experienced days they knew nothing about. You had learned things they never witnessed. Perhaps you had changed your priorities. Perhaps you had become more careful with your energy. Perhaps you had become more open. Maybe both. The stranger understood something your soulmate was only beginning to recognize. Finding you was not about recovering an old moment exactly as it had been. That moment was gone. If your paths ever crossed again, it would have to be two present-day people meeting honestly, without demanding that the past repeat itself. And strangely, that made the possibility feel more meaningful rather than less. Because now your soulmate was no longer imagining some perfect reunion. They were imagining a conversation. A real one. One where you could say what the experience had been like for you, even if your perspective differed completely from theirs. One where nobody needed to win the story. One where the unanswered question could finally become an honest answer, whatever that answer turned out to be. Don't skip this next moment, because your soulmate then said something the stranger had been waiting to hear without realizing it. I think I owe them an explanation. Not a declaration. Not a promise. An explanation. The stranger nodded, but challenged them immediately. An explanation for what? That question was harder than it sounded. Your soulmate began listing possibilities, then stopped. They did not owe you an explanation for having feelings. They did not owe you a dramatic justification for every choice. What they may have owed you was clarity about the one thing their silence had potentially distorted. That your importance had never disappeared simply because communication did. That was the truth underneath everything they had been telling this stranger. And once they finally recognized it, the story became simpler. They had cared. They became uncertain. They withdrew. You may have interpreted that withdrawal differently. Time passed. And now, through a completely unexpected conversation, your soulmate had finally heard their own behavior described from the outside. Sometimes clarity arrives like that, not as a lightning strike, but through an ordinary person asking the question everyone else avoided. The stranger stood near the doorway now, yet neither of them seemed ready to end the conversation. There was still one mystery hanging between them. Why had this stranger become so personally invested in someone they had never met? Your soulmate finally asked directly. Why do you care so much about finding them? The stranger's expression softened. For the first time, they seemed almost reluctant to answer. Something important was waiting here. They explained that years earlier, they had known someone who mattered deeply to them. Nothing dramatic had destroyed the connection. There had simply been hesitation, bad timing, and too many assumptions. Both people waited for certainty. Neither created it. Eventually life moved forward, as life does. There was no tragedy in the story. The stranger had built a good life and learned from it. But one lesson remained unmistakable. Sometimes people spend years wondering about conversations that could have taken 10 honest minutes. Hearing your soulmate speak about you had reminded them of that lesson. That was why they wanted to find you, not to interfere, not to carry messages you never asked for, but because meeting you someday would make the entire strange conversation feel complete. You had become connected to a realization they already understood from experience. And then the stranger made your soulmate promise one thing: if they ever approached you again, they would not arrive carrying expectations. They would arrive carrying honesty. Your soulmate agreed. Quietly. Completely. Yet something happened immediately afterward that neither person had planned. As the stranger reached for their phone to check the time, something on the screen caught their attention. Their expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for your soulmate to notice. "What?" your soulmate asked. The stranger stared for another second. Then looked back at them. Because a name had appeared somewhere completely ordinary, connected to something they had discussed earlier. It might have meant nothing. It might have belonged to someone else entirely. The stranger knew better than to assume. But beside that name was one small detail your soulmate had mentioned near the beginning of the conversation. The same unusual interest. The same familiar connection. The coincidence was enough to make both of them stop. Your soulmate leaned closer, then immediately pulled back, suddenly uncertain whether they even wanted to know. The stranger did not click anything. They did not search further. Instead, they asked one question: if this really could be them, do you actually want me to find out? Your soulmate stared at the screen, then toward the door, then back again. Minutes earlier, the answer would have been obvious. Now it was not. Because finding you had suddenly stopped being an intriguing idea. It had become a real possibility. And reality required courage that memory never had. Your soulmate took a slow breath. Then said something the stranger never expected: "No. Not yet." The phone lowered. The room became quiet again. But before you assume that was another retreat, understand what happened next. Your soulmate reached for their own phone instead. They opened something they had not looked at in a very long time. And there, still preserved beneath months of ordinary life, was the last message connected to you. They read it once. Then twice. And hidden in the final line was a detail they had completely forgotten, one that changed what they believed your last conversation had meant. The final line did not contain a confession. That was what made it so powerful. There was no dramatic declaration waiting inside those old words, no promise that could magically explain everything that had happened afterward. Instead, there was something quieter, an invitation disguised as ordinary kindness. You had written something that essentially left the future open, a simple acknowledgement that if life ever brought the conversation back around, you would not resent its return. Your soulmate stared at those words and realized they had remembered the emotion of that message while forgetting its actual meaning. Memory had slowly rewritten it into an ending because an ending was easier to understand than uncertainty. But the message itself had never said goodbye. And suddenly the stranger understood why your soulmate had gone silent. This was no longer about wondering whether you once cared. It was about realizing that your soulmate may have been given an opportunity to speak honestly, and simply had not recognized it at the time. "How long has that been sitting there?" the stranger asked. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. They were scrolling upward now, carefully, not obsessively, simply revisiting enough of the conversation to understand the context. And something became obvious almost immediately. You had not been chasing them. You had not been demanding reassurance. You had actually been doing something remarkably mature, meeting them at the level of openness they were capable of giving. When they became warm, you became warm. When they became distant, you gave space. When they returned, you responded without making them pay emotionally for having disappeared. But eventually, you stopped carrying the entire weight of keeping the connection alive. The stranger saw it too. They were giving you room, they said. Your soulmate nodded slowly. I thought they were losing interest. The stranger looked at them for a long moment before answering. Maybe they thought the same thing about you. And there it was. The simplest explanation in the entire story, sitting between them after all those complicated memories. Two people may have been reading the same silence in opposite directions. Neither necessarily rejected the other. Neither necessarily intended to create permanent distance. But when nobody names uncertainty, uncertainty begins writing its own story. And the story it writes is rarely generous. It tells one person, if they cared, they would say something. It tells the other, if they wanted you there, you would know. Then both people wait for evidence that can only exist if somebody stops waiting. Don't skip this moment, because your soulmate did something different now. They stopped scrolling. They stopped analyzing every sentence. They locked the phone and placed it down. The stranger expected another wave of questions, but your soulmate seemed calmer. Not because everything had been solved, but because they finally understood that the past could not be reconstructed perfectly from messages and memories. If there was ever another conversation with you, the only useful question would be what both of you felt now. And somewhere in that realization, the stranger's desperate curiosity began to soften as well. They had entered this story wanting to find you because you sounded fascinating. Now they understood that finding you was not the point. Respecting you was. You were not a missing character waiting to be returned to someone else's story. You had your own life, your own choices, your own version of what happened. If your soulmate ever stepped back into your world, they would have to be prepared for the possibility that you had changed completely. Perhaps you would welcome the conversation. Perhaps you would simply appreciate the honesty and continue forward. Perhaps you would surprise them with a perspective neither the stranger nor your soulmate had considered. Every possibility was valid. Strangely, accepting that uncertainty seemed to remove the pressure from the room. Something important is waiting for you here, because this was when the stranger finally explained what they meant earlier when they said they would recognize your story before recognizing your face. I don't actually need to find them, they admitted. Your soulmate looked confused. After everything? After all those questions? The stranger smiled. I think I already found what I was looking for. Your soulmate waited. And what was that? The answer came softly, proof that people can matter to each other without knowing how to say it properly. For several seconds, your soulmate said nothing. That sentence reached beyond you, beyond the stranger, beyond this single unfinished connection. Because almost everyone eventually discovers that relationships are not always divided neatly into people who cared and people who did not. Sometimes both cared. Sometimes both were confused. Sometimes timing exposed differences. Sometimes distance was necessary. Sometimes a connection becomes meaningful precisely because it teaches both people how they want to communicate differently next time. And sometimes, after enough growth, two people are given another conversation. Not because anything is guaranteed, but because they are finally capable of having it honestly. Your soulmate picked up their phone again. The stranger watched but said nothing. Your soulmate opened the place where they could potentially reach you. Their thumb hovered there for a moment. Then stopped. Not from fear. From consideration. What could they possibly say after so much silence without making the message heavier than it needed to be? They typed a sentence. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. The stranger almost laughed. You spent an hour telling me exactly what you feel, and now you can't write one sentence? Your soulmate smiled for the first time without tension. Apparently not. Then something shifted. They stopped trying to make the message impressive. They stopped searching for the perfect opening. They stopped trying to compress every memory into one paragraph. Instead, they wrote something simple. Something that asked for nothing. Something that did not assume you were waiting. Acknowledgement. Warmth. Honesty. That was all. But they still did not send it. Stay till the end, because the reason was not what you might think. Your soulmate suddenly realized that before reopening a door, they needed to know why they were knocking. Was it loneliness? Nostalgia? Curiosity created by this conversation? Or had something genuine remained beneath all of that? The stranger respected the question. Then don't send anything tonight, they said. Wake up tomorrow. Live your normal day. If the truth still feels the same when the emotion of this conversation settles, you'll know what deserves to be said. Your soulmate saved nothing dramatic. They simply placed the phone aside. And for the first time, the stranger stopped trying to find you. There was nothing else to search for. Whatever happened next belonged to you and your soulmate, not to anyone standing outside the story. Morning arrived quietly. No cinematic sign. No impossible coincidence. Just ordinary light, ordinary responsibilities, an ordinary day beginning. Your soulmate expected the intensity of the previous conversation to fade. Some of it did. The excitement disappeared. The mystery became smaller. But one thought remained surprisingly clear beneath everything else. They still wanted you to know that their silence had never meant what it may have appeared to mean. Hours passed. They went through the day. They tried not to overthink it. Then, sometime later, they opened their phone again. The unsent words were still there. This time they did not rewrite them. They simply read them. Once. Slowly. And just before deciding whether to send them, your soulmate noticed something they had completely missed the night before. There had been a change connected to you. Small. Recent. Entirely ordinary to anyone else. But to your soulmate, it suggested one thing they had never considered. While they had been wondering whether the past still mattered, you may have been quietly revisiting the same chapter too.